Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm John Carlson with the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event entitled Remaking the Human, Technoscience, Dignity, and the Meaning of Progress. Today's panel features some esteemed guests from law and the social and natural sciences who will be examining the ways that sites of scientific and technological innovation also serve as sites of moral reflection and spiritual inquiry. Our conversation speaks to enduring questions about the proper relationship among science and religion and technology, and with a particular focus today on what it means to be human. These questions are especially germane in our current moment as we face many challenges involving progress and human dignity in our world. Before we get started, I just wanted to bring your attention to another event that some of you might find of interest. It will be taking place on December 9th, also relates to questions of human dignity, a discussion entitled, What Happened Here Is Not Right, and it will be focusing on issues of surveillance and detention and civil rights in the post 9/11 era. And you can find out more about this and other events on our website, csrc.asu.edu. And on that site, you can also learn about our other initiatives, our research projects, events, podcasts, and various things going on here at the center. Today's conversation is part of our Beyond Secularization project on religion, science, and technology in public life. This is an interdisciplinary initiative housed here at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I'm now going to introduce Craig Calhoun, who will be moderating today's event. Professor Calhoun is a university professor of social sciences at Arizona State University. Before joining ASU, he was director of the London School of Economics, president of the Social Science Research Council, and a professor at NYU, Columbia, and UNC Chapel Hill. So in other words, just another guy we picked up off the street, right, Craig? Right. No, of course not. We're very pleased to have him now part of the ASU community. He is a social theorist and a comparative historian. He's published on social movements, social solidarity, knowledge, institutions, questions of political economy, religion, and the secular, and I could go on. Professor Calhoun will be introducing today's guests, and then we'll also lead a discussion with our speakers following their different talks. Audience members can submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom or the chat feature on YouTube. And I encourage you to submit your questions as soon as you have them. The sooner you do, the easier it is to start going through them and make sure they get queued up so the speakers can get to your questions. So again, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us for today's event. Craig, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks to everybody who has joined us as participants, and thanks above all to our speakers. We are sorry not to have Anya Bernstein with us, a remarkably interesting person who is going to provide a third perspective, but I'm counting on Antonio Damasio and Patricia Williams to each provide at least two perspectives, ensuring that we will have, in fact, a multidimensional conversation. Professors Williams and Damasio are two of the most extraordinary intellectuals at work on themes related to those of our conference. The conference, to remind you, Remaking the Human, Technoscience, Dignity, and the Meaning of Progress, packs a lot of different issues into those titles and a lot of different disciplines. The very idea of remaking the human is already, in some ways, a provocation to those who think that it can be referred to something seemingly unproblematic like nature. And the issues of technoscience are ubiquitous today. The idea of dignity, which since Kant has in crucial ways informed notions from human rights to medical science, is at issue and under challenge. And all of this is bound up with themes of the meaning of progress in challenging ways. Let me just introduce you to our two speakers briefly. They each have the distinction of inhabiting fields that outsiders think they understand, and yet revealing in their work how limited that understanding is. Outsiders think neuroscience is all about the brain, never mind the rest of the nervous system, or indeed the rest of the organism, or the broader perspectives that Antonio has brought to this. Outsiders have various ideas, love it or hate it, of the law, and indeed of the notion of critical race theory, with which Patricia Williams has been associated. And one has only to read just a start of her work to realize how much these are oversimplifications, and often loaded oversimplifications. Professor Williams is not just one of the most prominent legal theorists in America, she's one of the most prominent public intellectuals in the country, and her work spans law, literature, gender, race, ethics, and a range of other fields. She's perhaps best known for The Alchemy of Race and Rights, which was central to the creation of critical race theory, a profound intellectual project that bears at most a tangential relation to the current controversies that invoke that phrase. Professor Williams' other books include Giving a Damn, Racism, Romance, and Gone with the Wind, The Rooster's Egg, Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race, and Open House of Family, Food, Piano Lessons, and The Search for a Room of My Own. Her current research raises core questions close to our theme for today, questions of individual autonomy and identity in the context of legal and ethical debates on science and technology. Her work in the area of health and genetics, for example, questions how racial formation is shaped by the legal regulation of private industry and government. Her work on algorithms grapples with the auditing function of technology in our everyday lives, shaping how we understand who we are. Antonio Damasio is the Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Philosophy, and Director of Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. He's a preeminent neuroscientist, and Antonio Damasio has made major impact in neuroscience, but also in psychology and in philosophy, and in a range of interdisciplinary discussions, including even the nature of music and its relationship to hearing, and the distinctions between hearing and listening, and the way we focus in different settings and genres. His book, The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures, is a remarkable exploration of the evolutionary development of mind and the role of life regulation in the generation of cultures. His new book, Feeling and Knowing, is published today, a testimony to the continuity of what Hannah Arendt called natality, the birth, the new in all of our lives. Feeling and Knowing continues Antonio's long-standing examination of the integrated roles of emotions and feelings in decision-making and other cognitive processes. This has also been the focus for his numerous and widely cited specific research articles. Both of our panelists are the recipients of numerous awards. And in order that we may hear them speak and not just listen to me speak about them, I'm not going to list any of these, but instead I'm going to invite Patricia Williams to inaugurate our discussion. And each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes of their prepared remarks, and then engage in discussion with each other and with other participants in the event today online. Patricia?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I have been following this series over the course of several iterations. And in thinking and preparing for this, I was lying in between wakefulness and sleepiness, and I thought I was dreaming, but I actually heard Ben Hurlbut's voice speaking about Hannah Arendt. And it turns out I was not dreaming, but recently he was on Christopher Lydon's podcast, Open Source, and it was a real invitation for me to think about or to frame my speech with regard to what he was talking about on that program, which I must say I highly recommend. But he was discussing what Hannah Arendt had written in the preface to her book, The Human Condition, to wit, that an emphasis on the technological question of how we can engineer life in the laboratory, on the how we can do that, obscures or distracts from the question of why we would do it. In other words, we don't get to the ethical question of whether we ought to. So I heard Ben as asking about a number of domains. First, whether we are literally recruiting technology that dehumanizes us, but also whether that process of technological dehumanization, that threat to our dignitary interests, does not also serve to diminish our capacity ever to reconnect with those lost features of what we call humanity. And this is a big ask of a question. So I'll try to focus my thoughts on my worries solely about the legal realm and the geography of public deliberative governance. And I'll arrange my talk under 3 topics of concern, broad categories. So I'm only going to take a little piece of each of these categories. The first is capacity. The second is parasociality. And the third is temporal disordering that undergirds many of our discussions about progressive time. So the first, capacity. I don't think I have time to say as much as I'd like to about the question of capacity. In law, cognitive capacity in particular is so central to our jurisprudential notion of autonomy, a vexed notion in any event that is impossible, I think, to address right here and right now. But it's based, for our purposes now, based on a notion of the human as tethered both by normative physical body and normative cognitive capacity. A reasonable person standard, I guess, would be one eliciting of that or translation of that. But new technology complicates that image in our increased awareness of how technology might complete certain incompletions of the body and of the mind, and how it increases our awareness of entanglements that go beyond the bounds of the anthropocentric, or certainly anything like a Cartesian duality, and how it redefines concepts of singular and plural, private and collective, humans as expressive creatures, and new domains of financial expression enabled by blockchain. So at the same time, we are mortal beings still. We still yearn to be otherwise. And in this past year of so much death and grief, I keep thinking of this story. When baseball legend Ted Williams died in 2002, it came to light that he had directed that his body be cryogenically frozen so that he and his children would, quote, be able to be together in the future, even if it is only a chance. And at the time, when I remember that happening, it seemed strange to me, a desire for immortality so intensely overwhelming that one would slow the body's decomposition to molecular silence, the breath held in wait for the perfect cure. And I think the global pandemic actually helped me better understand that determined longing for biostasis. In mid-March of last year, friends began to die. I began to lose my mind. And today, post-vaccination and millions of global deaths later, and still this fog of uncertainty, I feel like I am slowly waking up, like Rip Van Winkle, much more than merely a year older, and not at all the same. I feel as though I have been almost cryogenically preserved by a shock of flash freezing, and I am thawing now, slushy and watery and uncertain in my body. But I must say, I am still in a state of thawing. My juridically defined capacity still feels a little frozen, and maybe we all are. After all, here we are at a panel that interrogates the human, delivering papers that aren't really papers, through a non-textual medium. The word we use is so apt. We are remote. We are remote from, with, and to one another. And for me, who was raised in such a different social modality just because of my age, it is challenging. It's like working behind a giant mechanical mask. It doesn't feel epistolary at all, at least not in the sense that writing usually does for me. Even in speaking to you through Zoom, in order to perform myself to you, I have to stand inside an exoskeleton of myself. I have to learn to walk with a prosthetic, calculate every interaction, learn how to allow this platform, in effect, my mechanical brain, to recognize the voice, the inflection, the mood, the personality, not just of you, my audience, but also of myself. I have to translate and perform myself in order to communicate the mood of me, in order to recreate the three-dimensionality one takes for granted intrapersonis. It is a rather painful or awkward stretch, at the least, to coordinate myself in relation to this thing in order to make complex communication possible. My life, or everyone's life, is so significantly reduced by having to present ourselves through a technology whose very name captures, again, the dilemma of the remote. And it is this sensory deprivation that I have found hardest to bear. I've read somewhere that Elon Musk's, quote, self-driving Tesla cars are outfitted with autopilots that, according to one test, mistake the moon for a yellow light, a yellow traffic light. And it advises or slows down the car involuntarily. And this, I think, is such a lovely and poetic confusion of signals. According to Business Insider, Tesla has also mistaken the setting sun for a red traffic light, a stoplight. And I sometimes feel like that Tesla on autopilot. Being constantly remote has hobbled my ability to translate the motion of the world and its masslessness into images. My relation to plotting space and place.
This is almost like a comment on just what Patricia Williams was talking about.
She probably does not know that she's
frozen.
Yeah.
She may be, and I suspect our support team are reaching out to her to
stimulate the nervous system.
Okay, Patricia?
Yes.
We lost about a minute and a half of you, as though the technology was reacting to your very comments on remoteness. So you were just talking about spatiality and plotting space and time when you froze.
I was at the Tesla car.
Yes, you had just finished with the moon and the yellow light.
And okay. And it's mistaking the sun for a red stoplight. Right. In any event, I don't know whether you heard me talking about the degree to which the watching myself, I can never escape watching myself in the material enactment of W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness. I am always watching myself as I watch others watching me. So I experience these platforms as somewhat fictional, surreal, and perhaps because my own sense of reality depends on the echo of how a real voice in a real room hits the ear, or how a happy person smells, or how a handshake or a hug stimulates the nervous system, or how looking directly into someone's eyes reveals small inflections that enhance the meaning of words as they are spoken. I rely on the presence of students to read a room. I rely on subtle expressions that signal mood, a head tilted in questioning, a slouch of boredom, an excited buzzing among ones who've made an important connection. But on Zoom, the tiny heads of my students and of you all are lined up like an advent calendar. When people wish to speak, their tiny little yellow hands, those cartoon Mickey Mouse mittens, go up and down like nautical semaphores. Voices are muted and unmuted, on and off like a sound faucet. And when I divide students into problem-solving subgroups, there is no friendly collegial hum to the room. Using the chat room feature, everyone just drops out of sight, out of sound, out of existence, with something like a kitchen timer at the bottom of the screen, blipping down the seconds till they reappear, bursting to the surface like divers from the deep. Yet, it's true, this has been better than nothing, and we all have made do. But a year of such mediation was disembodying in all these literal ways. So Sherry Turkle, in her book Alone Together, writes of the terrible cost to adolescent development when young people resolve emotional states only by turning to online communities that reflect their mood instantly and unconditionally. And she refers to that kind of narcissism, to that kind of suspension as narcissism, in that children never learn to translate what they're feeling to those who may feel differently. She cites the condition of mourning a loss or death of a friend or of loved ones. And if one takes that grief and plunges oneself in a room of voices where everyone feels exactly the same, it's actually limiting in the long run. One never learns to externalize that pain by explaining and bringing into alignment the social world in which one's physical body is situated. One speaks to avatars, Facebook friends without bodies, Instagram colonies, Snapchat ghosts, but one doesn't necessarily perform the labor of talking to one's parents or teachers or siblings, that labor necessary to align one's community with the interior life, with the long-term community knowledge of one's intimates. And the ability to speak to differently situated others, the learned acquisition of the skills of how to persuade and engage and rouse empathy in them, becomes underutilized, a diminished capacity. And I think that this brings me to my second concern, which is that of parasociality. And the word parasocial occurs to me as I survey this year of lost-minded time. Parasociality is defined as a one-sided relationship with another who exists at a distance, most often a media personality like a celebrity. It is not only one-sided, but an illusory relation, an attributed sense of intimacy or proximity, such as a crush on a pop star or the daydream of an imaginary friend. Parasociality is the projection one places on someone who does not reciprocate or who may not even know you exist. I'm co-opting the word a bit because it's a technical term in media studies, but there is something powerful about the idea of life imagined as living among others without them in reality. And in that way, a year on Zoom was sometimes like talking to the dead. Some days, the geography of our miniature, tile-rendered screen world was like floating through gardens of computer-generated ghosts. Sealed in my home office, I would toss the bottle of my ideas into that flat imaginary sea, trusting that it would find shore and be released like a religious revelation upon the screens of extant others. A clutching neediness sustained my reaching out to partial people through ritual Zoom communion. And I call them partial people. I mean people who exist somewhere in the present tense, but whom I could only apprehend as bumblebees captured in a jar, wings beating and buzzing against glass walls. They hummed with the threat and the promise to break out as real. And I fear that one of the costs of sustained parasociality is inability to come back down to earth, to just stop and listen to what real others are really saying. Moreover, in law, rightly or wrongly, many of our evidence rules are premised on face-to-face encounter, and a lot of trials have gone to Zoom space. And a lot of law, our evidentiary laws, are based on the reading of the body, the sweaty palms, the twitching eye, the degree of eye contact, posture, fidgeting, and an ineffable sense of dodginess or not. Now, often, of course, those judgments can be quite wrong in person, given to prejudices and subjective hunch. And that unreliability of how we view each other in human encounters, such as courtrooms, has engendered not merely increasing distrust of traditional legal disposition like jury findings, but a transfer of trust to new technologies to do the job for us, to use machines to measure our physical and emotional deviance, volatility, or civility of comportment. So now, in the name of better interpretability and mind reading, we are increasingly relying on machines, on facial recognition, algorithmic mood discerners that read our muscles with anatomical precision, and then deliver those phenotypical profiles as transparently factual of what lies beneath. And so the figure of the human as an undecipherable mush is rapidly giving way to an exoskeletal assemblage of mind data points. In this turn to digitized cyborgs, I worry that we have not sufficiently interrogated an underlying cultural faith that feelings, motives, and the interior states can even be read with the precision we think of as machine neutrality and machine perfectionism. We don't seem to be questioning whether there ever really can be an interpretation machine and assigner of meaning that will be more accurate than the psychologically read body, or the juridically read body, or the conceptually autonomous legal subject. We just greet it as there simply must be. At a different point in time, there was phrenology. Today, it is the algorithmically read body that will tell all. We forget that all itself is an abstraction. And so we place our faith in the ubiquitous images of trillions of little white dots in the shape of humans, the data constellations of human form that supposedly represent our species, the machine-learned vision of Vitruvian man. Finally, the last category is the question of temporalities, which needs to be interrogated as well. How to unsettle what we do solely in the name of progress. The notion of progress has for a few centuries now been rooted in a vision of time that is largely religiously inflected. I'm thinking of John Bunyan's enormously influential allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1678. In it, Christian, the hero, sets out from his home, the city of destruction, to seek the uphill path toward the city on the hill, which is heaven. And the way is paved with sin and dangerous opportunities, but the valiant Christian exemplifies his resistance of that temptation. Indeed, the hard labor of resisting is symbolized in the directionality of pressing uphill, always upward. Traveling uphill also signifies traveling forward in time into the future, the uphill future, which contains the joyful promise of heaven, which is to come, as the subtitle had it. And Bunyan's vision of staying the course underwrites much of our political discourse to this day. It is mythologized in our imagining of time as an arrow that inevitably points to the better. It is a future time, a future tense that heals all wounds. I happen to love the work of Lera Boroditsky, a cognitive psychologist and linguist who studies the way language structures our sensations of time, of direction, of gender, of life and death and community. For example, she writes of an Andean language where, unlike Pilgrim's Progress, the future is behind us and the past is in front or ahead. And it's interesting to think of time like that. We speakers of English outcomes think of time as a kind of road that proceeds from the known terrain we have already traversed and into the unknown lands or places we have yet to reach. In contrast, if as in that Andean community, the future is behind us, it rearranges our focus. I think it might make us less motion propelled, more cautious. Our mothers teach us to put one foot ahead of the other to get ahead. It takes more balance and deliberation to think of moving into the future by putting one foot behind the other. It slows us a bit. Behind is what you can't see. In front of you is what you can see, what you have seen, and therefore what you know. And as bipedal creatures, we tend to walk into the spaces that are in front of us. Therefore, in this Andean language, we are constantly walking into historical dimensions, moving forward through history, a bit like Benjamin's angel. And that is a substantially different vision of how not just Western languages or systems of thought configure our imaginative geography, but how it's being built into the architecture of technology as well. I remember an author I read in a college sociology class analogizing our sense of time to a series of pails like units on a rolling conveyor belt. And our mission is to fill every bucket with as much stuff as we can before the bucket moves on. And that sense of progress contains a sense of urgency. Can't let things pass by without filling every second. And I think one of the side effects of La Vida online is that it feels as though we are losing a sense of history. That's what I worry about. On the one hand, everything we do is stored, never forgotten, and we are haunted with the presence of its immovability, the refusal of any possibility of erase, and every lost stupid word lives on to abide with us like bad-tempered ghosts. At the same time, the clickbaiting tempo of our internet existence is constructed as an everlasting present tense. It is expansively horizontal, so that we learn everything about what everyone is doing on the planet at this particular millisecond, but then we have to rush ahead to keep up with the next millisecond before we're left behind. If my mother always told me to think before I spoke, that advice has little purchase today, buried as we are in volcanic eruptions of disinformation. And we've always had disinformation and snake oil salesmen, but today we are struggling with a technologically enhanced state of emergency, and that scares me about this time. I don't know how to introduce the slowed time and the deliberative space we need for rational decision-making under our present circumstances. And without deliberative space, or even the habit of deliberation, a lot of what we mean by law and democracy flies out the window. It's why a lot of my academic writing these days is focused on the role of technological influence in heightening emotional states into frenzy, into a mechanically induced sense of speed and urgency, a mood I call the screaming now, now. And just consider the way we end up as technological cohorts, yet cohorts of us who are all but strangers. A lot of the writing about Facebook's organizational AI is coming to public notice of late, but it has, and to a great degree continues, to filter messages according to those people with whom you interact most actively. So what you see on your feed is not necessarily chronological, like sequentially dated email feed. Rather, Facebook sequences what comes up on your feed by the frequency of times you've connected with someone. Responding increases the probability that you will forever be interacting only with those who provoke an answer from you. By the same token, that likelihood increases that Facebook's algorithm will filter out from your feed a message from a dear friend or loved one with whom you haven't communicated in years. And this metric of frequency as a prime metric of supposed favored friendship is entirely unrelated to actual substantive import of content. Indeed, it has much more to do with measuring emotion, excitement, anger, distress, urgency, agitation. All increase the chances they will be provoked into frequent or heated back and forth with someone. And this is precisely why Facebook is so often accused of manipulating toxic outcomes. This kind of foregrounding can suck us into tighter and tighter circles of emotional intensity while actually suppressing calmer, slower, more thoughtful exchange. And so we are sorted not only by our preferences, our shopping habits, but again, as by our self-consciousness of what others around us are doing. And we are sloshed into categories of the like-minded, the like-behaving, the like-looking. We are typed, stereotyped, archetyped, judged, prejudged, and assorted in a process that very much resembles being raced. After all, the word race means genre, type, sort. Algorithms sort us in a process that is a species of re-racing, in that it builds cohorts of assigned social meaning, cohorts that are reinforced by a process of channeling that effectively operates like a mini destiny-making machine. In this sense, racing isn't just about phenotype or color or ethnicity, but about every life habit, every purchase, every mode of our surveillance trail of travel, diet, property acquisition, employment records, encounters with police. It is a behemoth of a surveillance model, a market-based model based on who's in and who's out. It's a tech-triggered and manipulated urge to align oneself with the right kind of people, even if the composition of that right kind of people is shifting constantly in this new universe. And this is identity politics in its most primitive, and yet also in its most sophisticated sense.
Patricia, thank you for all of the probing questions as well as the partial answers in that talk. I think Patricia's talk responds to Van Hurlbut and Hannah Arendt, as she said at the beginning, but it opens an exchange with Antonio Damasio, who is a very appropriate interlocutor for this. Let me remind you, Antonio is the author of books with titles like Descartes' Error. the feeling of what happens. Looking for Spinoza, and self comes to mind. Each of these, as well as his new books like Feeling and Knowing, raise questions that I hope he will take up, giving us his own introductory remarks, but then eventually in discussion with Patricia and her ideas about the excitation of emotional response, the calmness of reason, and paths to the future. Antonio?
Good. Thank you very much for inviting me. Very pleased to be here, not there, and there not. So let me begin by outlining my general understanding of your topic for me. And I have sort of reworded it to orient myself. And what I reworded is something like contemporary science and the role of its developments, the role that its developments may play in our conceptions of humanity, human individuality, and human dignity. And of course, in sort of seeing it in this perspective, I was very much helped by the questions that Ben Hurlbut sent us. And I will, at some point, if we have the time, come to some of those specific questions and try to produce an answer. But before I go any further, I would like to have as a first point some distinction between general science and biology and neuroscience. I think it's perfectly justifiable because neuroscience is highly productive and is highly in fashion. So we tend to connect and think of neuroscience rather than science in general when we consider questions such as the ones that Ben outlined for us. So I think that we need to have a little bit of an adjustment of perspective, and it is important to say something like the following that I have written here in a note. We are first and foremost living organisms, and those living organisms began their ascent with life inside them, with homeostatic regulations, but without nervous systems. And this is very important because at this point in our history, we sort of cannot imagine easily the fact that there were, for most of life on Earth, organisms that had a beginning and an end, had a course of life, but in fact had no nervous system whatsoever. So a lot of the things that we discuss and are interested in, for example, in relation to this symposium and some of the questions that Ben posed to us are questions that require the nervous system in order to be considered and answered. But in fact, they relate to organisms that began by not having a nervous system. And I wanted to give you a little bit, Craig referred to this new book, and I opened it on a page in which I have a few things that I would like to read for you that have to do with the calendar of life. And one is that proto-cells begin about 4 billion years ago. The very first cells in prokaryotes, such as bacteria, begin about 3.8 billion years ago. The first single cells with a nucleus, eukaryotes, are just 2 billion years away. The first multicellular organisms, though, only appeared about 700 million years ago. And the first nervous cells about 500 million years ago. We're coming somewhat closer. And then put this against the fact that hominids are about 14 to 12 million years old, and Homo sapiens is only about 300,000 years. So what I want to mark first is the idea that life has been developing and getting more and more complex, but it has had this long history largely without the help of nervous systems. And I think this is extremely important. Now, I think that the next question that one should ask is why nervous systems, where do they come from, and what are they bringing to us? Why did we, in fact, develop nervous systems? And of course, there are several ideas about that, but the main one that I would like to put forth is that nervous systems were a way into organizing complexity and into allowing for the continuation of function once we had organisms that were not just multicellular, but multi-system, and where in fact you needed considerable coordination of the systems if life was not simply going to explode and disappear. So the lineage here is from life regulation and its homeostatic the principles and rules to growing complexity, the appearance of nervous systems as, in fact, coordinators of possible function. And then at some point, already within the realm of existing nervous systems, the development of this extraordinary kind of phenomenon, which is feeling. And actually, because of Dr. Williams' comments on emotion, with which I entirely agree, I want to make very clear that when I talk about feeling, I am not talking about emotion. And there again, we have a point of historical precedence. Long before there were emotions in our lives, there were feelings. And what I'm talking about when I talk about feeling is about something that is subjective and is something that is not manifest into the outside world, contrary to what happens with emotions, which are in fact through and through about actions that are directed to the outside, as curiously the etymology even implies. So feeling is about something internal, something that is in your mind. It was probably in the beginning of your mind, and which I like to think, and currently I'm making this as a very strong proposal, is the idea that feelings were the inaugural events of consciousness. So when people talk about consciousness, which is absolutely vital to discuss all that we're trying to accomplish in this symposium, and absolutely essential to make sense of what Professor Williams just told us. When people think about consciousness and its possible origins and makeup, one unfortunate idea, especially in the past few decades, especially after the 60s, is the idea that this is a mystery that is unsolvable and that we're not going to be able to make complete sense of what it is to begin with, and even less make sense of how it could have come about in a biological system. I think that is just not so. I think it's reasonable to call consciousness a hard problem, but by no means an impossible to solve mystery. I think these are two very different things. And so getting back to my little story, I see feelings as the beginning, as the inaugural event of consciousness. And I'm going to venture that prior to the appearance of feelings in organisms that of necessity were multicellular, were multi-system, and already had the nervous system, prior to the development of consciousness, all that we could rely on was life, in fact, very complex life, with a variety of the characteristics that we know today in living systems, but the regulation of that life, the application of the principles of homeostasis to that life so that it would continue for as long as its genome allowed it to continue, was done by what I like to call a covert intelligence. So organisms clearly were intelligent. When you see bacteria without even a nucleus, literally, quote unquote, choosing the point of the environment where they're going to be, where they can coalesce with others, choosing, for example, temperature, amount of nutrients in that environment, and literally running their lives so that their life can continue. You see that there's an intelligence at play there They're mechanisms that are being used to maintain that life in operation according to principles of homeostasis. What I do not think is the case is that bacteria know what they're doing. I don't think they do. I don't think they have a consciousness. I don't think they have a mind. And what they lack at the beginning of those things that they do not have is the possibility of feeling. Feeling, for me, is the possibility of judging and producing a mental correspondence to the degree of success or failure in life regulation at any given moment. And if life is being reasonably well orchestrated and it's taking place without huge limitations, feelings are positive. And if not, we have certain things that we take for granted that we, multicellular, multi-system, nervous organisms, recognize very easily. And there is feelings such as hunger, thirst, desire, pain, well-being, malaise, and all of these are what I like to call, in technical terms, homeostatic feelings, because they simply indicate to you that the organism is in a state where it requires a particular action or it does not. And in fact, it's signaling to you that it is time, it's giving you an opportunity to do things that otherwise you shouldn't do if you are in fact in a state, a deficit that is betrayed by hunger or thirst or pain. Again, on the point of consciousness and on its enormous importance to make sense of the entire discussion we're having here today, the feelings correspond to a need, and feelings appear in a setting where there is a certain organization of life, where there is a certain procession of events in the history of life, and where they actually provide something that is decisive in terms of life and its continuation or death. Because if, for example, an organism that is equipped with feelings does not heed its feelings and does not listen to the message of pain, hunger, and thirst, for example, that organism is not going to last very long. So this is the beginning of my talk, if you don't mind, is to make clear that we do not begin our life with consciousness, do not begin our life with a maximum complexity of the kind that we have today. We begin it very simply. At a certain point, nervous systems and the possibility of feelings and therefore consciousness are added on to the mix. And once that happens, there's the possibility of projecting that feeling and that consciousness that arises from feeling onto all the other events that nervous systems produce for us in abundance, which have to do with the perception of the outside world in all its different modalities, and with the possibility of constructing mental states which continue to be guided by feeling to a considerable extent, and then eventually will also be guided by what we will call knowledge and reason, the possibility of manipulating reason in such a way that we have creativity depending on memory systems and so forth. But that position of homeostatic feelings in this story is absolutely critical, and it's that gives you the entry into consciousness and eventually the entry into this much larger cognitive system that I am talking about. Again, because of Professor Williams' mention of emotion, there's really no confusion possible with the feelings of homeostasis versus emotions or the feelings of emotions. The feelings of emotions are the feelings that we have when we have an experience, therefore a conscious state of certain conditions of our organism, when we are, for example, plunged into a state of fear or of anger or of love or of joy. Those are concerts of actions that throughout development we have put together and have actually a certain degree of stereotypy. Emotions such as fear or anger or joy are universally recognizable, and even animals that are not human have traces of those stereotypic action concert arrangements that you can easily recognize. But once those action programs are engaged, then we have the possibility of experiencing the states of our organism as the organism is placed in, for example, the emotion of fear or the emotion of love and compassion. And so the interesting thing is that we have to make this very clear distinction between those fundamental primary homeostatic feelings that come first and foremost and that inaugurate consciousness as far as I'm concerned, and that allow life to continue and develop in complexity, and these other feelings that we have when we engage emotions. And of course, in the course of any normal day, we engage them all. Of course, here we are in the middle of the afternoon for probably all of us. And of course, we've already had hunger and thirst. Hopefully, we did not have pain, but we've already been also in states in which we were pleased with what was happening around us or not. We already had probably a minute or two of anxiety over something in our lives. So what we have then now is a long symphony of processes where you have those fundamental feelings that allow us to remain in a conscious state until we turn off that consciousness, for example, in deep sleep or in anesthesia, and then the feelings that have to do with all of these other emotive states that we also engage in during the day. And lo and behold, we also have this other world of cognitive developments that I talked about, and which I think are actually extremely important, because when I think the interest for the organizers of this conference is to discuss these developments, not just strictly the neuroscientific, but the broadly biological, and to relate them to what is going on in our society, to what is going on in our cultures. And of course, the part that most relates to our culture, where the neuroscience actually plays a key part, is in the generation of all these cognitive products, the generation of factual knowledge, the possibility of memory, reasoning, language, creativity, all of those processes that are in fact responsible for the emergence of this great human adventure called culture. This is where we're going to find the roots of developments that appear in religion, they appear in the law, they appear in science and technology, of course, and that appear in the arts. And curiously, you continue using, even at that high level of cognitive development, which relies on our extremely complex nervous system, you still continue to use functional possibilities that come from very early on, and that come from that transition of early life into neural life. And I'm referring once again to feeling. And so Craig mentioned this very wisely when he was introducing me. Let's not think about this purely in terms of neuroscientific developments. There's no question, of course, that what neuroscience is bringing to this conversation is very, very important and very big. But it's something that is more about life within which nervous system is inhered. It's not about nervous systems, and life is a sort of little thing that comes tagged on to the nervous system. Now, the bigger picture is the picture of life, and nervous systems are servants to that life. And curiously, you keep using, especially the homeostatic feelings, you keep using them in a way we mark and organize the very complex cognitive cultural life. And we're constantly finding in feelings and in that organization of life the impetus to produce certain analyses, the desire to study certain problems. All of that comes out of this dialogue, this back and forth between the very high achievements of the nervous system within life and very low level achievements which were there already. Last night I was thinking about how I was going to end my little talk, and I wrote down a few words, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read them to you, and it says the following. And now I'm connecting directly with human dignity, and we can, of course, address this later in the question period. So the part of human dignity that relates to life has to be shared with plenty of other beings of other species that preceded us in evolution and are still with us, of course. Even aspects of humanity that we often regard as emblematic of human exceptionality and dignity, for example, feeling and sociality, are not exclusively human. So what is distinctively human is its own grade of creativity and the cultural products thereof, for they have created a historical fabric of ideas, behaviors, codes, laws, beliefs that are radically novel and that impose or recommend behaviors of a unique kind. And the radical novelty, I think, is important because even with all the wonderful things that we can discover in terms of, for example, complex primate behavior, or sometimes even complex behavior in mollusks that do not have the complexity of an ape and yet have incredibly complex behaviors, there is nothing that, at least I can envision, that resembles what we call our cultures, that resembles the complexity of ideas that we have, for example, when we are deciding the problem of law. Or a problem, for example, of rules and regulations in modern society. So while the roots of all these new products are biological and some are extremely old, they appear in new settings and guises, and they certainly deserve special consideration. And so I would end by saying that in my proposed sequence of events, I would start with life. I would start with covert level homeostasis, which, by the way, leads to a covert level intelligence, but nonetheless intelligence, because clearly there is an intelligence at work when you see what's going on in unicellular organisms living in a petri dish. Then the appearance of sociality, which is by no means a human phenomenon. It's something that precedes us by a long, long time. Feeling, then deliberated homeostasis. And of course, once you go to deliberated homeostasis, there you are already thinking in terms of consciousness. You have to know in literal terms that something is happening, and where that something is happening is in your body. The reason why, by the way, feeling and consciousness have to be connected is that what feeling does is not only give you information about something that is happening that is important to you, but is telling you where that is happening and where that is important, that happens to be your body. That automatic co-location of feeling and your body, which is alive and about which you need to do something, that's the crux of the matter. And that's where the problem of consciousness can be solved, which will help if we're going to continue this conversation. And then once you have consciousness, of course, and the possibility of generating minds out of all the other, now quite truly, neural systems, we have the possibility of creativity, we have the possibility of generating cultures, and we have the possibility of novelty. And I would stop right there, although one of the questions that Ben asked had to do with artificial intelligence, and I would be very happy to entertain a little conversation on that issue, because it is true that in addition to the plain intelligence that was covered in organisms without nervous systems, we now have this brilliant intelligence that we have in creatures that are minded and conscious and equipped with high-level brains, but we're also encountering the possibility of generating intelligence out of artifacts, which is of a different kind, and we may want to discuss what kind that is, and what can be done and what might not be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you also for your concluding remark, which points to an important message for all of our participants. Antonio has invited you to ask him to elaborate further on some themes or to take up new ones. And I want to invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom system and prepare for the larger discussion. But before we go to the audience questions, and even before we go to my questions, I want to ask Patricia if she has any thoughts in response to Antonio, and see if there's a bit of a dialogue further between the two of them that we might want to pursue. And I'm prepared to try to provoke this if need be.
I think she's muted.
Patricia, you're muted.
She's muted.
There you are. She's got it.
Am I present now?
You're present.
Professor Damasio, my question really follows through on your very last point. As I observe the development and the discussions around certain manifestations of artificial intelligence, which is described at any rate as self-generating and self-driving and even autonomous, but in some instances seems to be patterned upon neural networks of one sort or another, but are coded. Is this more in the realm of simply analogy to call this artificial intelligence a form of self-replicating life, or by some other standard compared to the what did you call it, the covert homeostasis of very basic life forms? Does it fall within that category?
Well,
because I ask that specifically because I think the question of governance is constantly on my mind, and so how one begins to govern it or not, it's governability. It seems to me is very much on line in that categorization.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that I would say is that when you refer to life in relation to these artificial networks, the first thing to say is that they are not living. They are not alive at all. So they are.
I'm not calling it that, but I think the entire transhumanist movement talks about this as a form of life.
They are. Their problem is that they're not live, and maybe actually that's not their problem. Maybe that's their great beauty as far as we are concerned for the time being. But there is a fundamental one thing that I would like to point out as a fact is this fundamental distinction between those systems and living systems such as ours, and any living system that is intelligence in the sense that it is doing things that will help maintain its life, because that's where intelligence begins. Let's see if I can continue my metabolism so that I don't die by in 5 hours. And what is so interesting is that these machines in general are characterized by a complete lack of vulnerability. So, we wrote a paper now about 2 years ago, which came out in Nature Machine Intelligence, where we asked the question about what would happen if we would take robots and we would instill those robots with vulnerability. And it's a very interesting question, because unless you would take a hammer to the robot and destroy it, the hammer is not going to get sick. It's not going to die. I mean, it can have some little sickness in a circuit, but there's nothing in it that is perishable. So it lacks vulnerability. We, on the contrary, are completely vulnerable. We have to feed ourselves and drink every day, or else. And we pray to all sorts of diseases, and we pray to all sorts of attacks. So we are totally vulnerable. And so the idea was this: given that we have become so brilliantly intelligent with all this vulnerability in our structures and functions, what if we would introduce a little bit of vulnerability in robotics using actually existing techniques such as soft robotics? Because it might be that introduction of vulnerability might actually make them more intelligent in certain ways, and a little bit more like our kind of intelligence, or not. It was very interesting, because even from the commentaries of the reviewers, which varied between saying this is brilliant and others that said this is completely silly. Why do you want to have vulnerable robots? Forget it. But in the end, the paper was published, and the comments continued along the same lines. Some people thinking this is intriguing and you should look into it, and people saying, well, why do you want that? I mean, we find the way it is. Artificial intelligence is making billionaires every day. Why do you want vulnerable artificial intelligence? So that would be my comment at this point.
May I take the liberty of interjecting there, and this for either of you to respond to, although it's more directly to Antonio. I've been of the view for some time that we may confuse matters when we imagine that artificial intelligence is like artificial human intelligence in the strict sense. And so we say, oh, is it like the brain in some sense? Are we modeling the brain, or vice versa? Can we have computer models of the brain? And we do that when we speak of robots and we ask about them, because we imagine discrete intelligences at the level of human beings. Now, here's my question. What if artificial intelligence is not like the intelligence of persons, but like the intelligence of markets or bureaucracies, or those artificially created persons with no soul to damn and body to kick, corporations? Is it arguable that the developments of artificial intelligence develop out of that human capacity to create these systems in which we constantly find ourselves? Now, I take it back not just to the governance questions, certainly, but to the questions that Professor Williams started about how we find ourselves in systems, and we see ourselves and monitor ourselves in relationship to them. We may or may not find other people in those systems. We may feel disembodied, disconnected. They may seem only indirectly present. Isn't that true in a way of markets and of bureaucracies in a sense as well? So my question is, what do we make of the intelligence of these indirect human creations?
Interesting. I like that idea very much. And I think that the taking artificial intelligence or using in part as a model for artificial intelligence what goes on in cultural intelligence in terms of our relationships in cultural settings, I think it's an excellent idea. And actually, it makes sense. And it's more likely that it developed that way, at least modern artificial intelligence, than through some kind of copy or inspiration from living organisms. Of course, I'm old enough to have been around people like, for example, Warren McCulloch at MIT, at the time the entire field was exploding, and at that time it was life that was inspiring them. Although, of course, they had a full knowledge of the field of engineering and a full knowledge of the field of culture as it presented itself. So even then, it could have been an inspiration. That's a very interesting idea. I like it.
Have I provoked you at all with this, Patricia, or should I probe a little further?
No, it's interesting because you mentioned corporations and the corpus of law to some degree, and there's a wonderful article written in the 1930s called "Transcendental Nonsense," because at that moment corporations were always figured as having heads and actual bodies. And if you go back to the time of Blackstone, corporations were, he describes them as immortalizing the human body. An individual burgher or storekeeper would die, and the corporation was invented to be a ghost or a continuation of the human relation of that business arrangement. And
who said that? Sorry, can you repeat that?
William Blackstone, who wrote one of the original dictionaries of law back in the 1700s. But in the 1930s, this case involving where is a corporation, lots of courts were simply saying, well, a corporation which is operating in many states, will find out where the head is, and that's constantly where the head is, this article concludes, we are so captivated by the metaphor, the power of this imagined head, that we have to realize that it's not literally a body, that it is a loose system of business relations that is arranging our responses. So in that sense, it's like an extended emotional configuration, and and so I think of it as, again, almost a spiritual emanation from the complexity of our culture, a spiritual emanation from the cultural arrangements that are the complexities of that beyond feelings, beyond emotions. We make these systems where we see a body where there isn't any, but it's actually a regulatory function of our imaginations that is a little bit like religion, in that it ties us together. It's religare, it ties us into arrangement. And I think it's why I'm curious about this new technology, which some of which is clearly just mechanical, but in other ways is entering new realms of liveliness or vivacity. And that's why the question of how one orders it in this regulatory imaginative space makes me, is this an extension of our imagination, or is it really that this is providing a new species of vivacity that is captured by this concept of singularity, for example?
Let me just add one word. All of your imagery was, of course, about the body, and think of the term corporation. The term corporation is very loaded. Right there.
It's a very religious notion. I mean, it's literally, and the corporation was literally within the Christian designation of the body of Christ. Our law was.
Well, and more than that, right? So one of the roots of the corporation is the bishop as a corporation soul, holding the law of the church. And we have the whole set of doctrines of the king's two bodies, the two bodies, the church, the two bodies of Christ. I mean, a whole series of very long-term dealings with embodiment and disembodiment in some sense, the production of social organisms that don't directly, in the same sense, represent physical embodiment. I'm struck when Patricia quoted Blackstone passage. Go back to Thomas Hobbes and the opening passages of Leviathan, in which he is telling us that the state is actually a kind of corporation. It's a great body of state, and the heart is but a spring, and the nerves are so many strings, and the joints are so many wheels, and there is a head of the state, and this is why we need the king. And so we have a long dealing with these things. Now, part of what, now I take this back to Patricia, I wanted to ask is, how about, you talked about disembodiment when we find ourselves in these communicative apparatuses that we've created, like Zoom conferences. What about the sort of differential embodiment or awareness of embodiment in other settings, say in relation to markets where we tend to forget that there are bodies at the other end of the process, or in relation to states where we have very hierarchically structured recognition or non-recognition of this. And friend, I think there's an interesting question about bodies we don't notice. Let me make a I hope interesting, but point about it. You borrowed the idea of parasociality and pointed to the communications research on one-sided relationships with others. I'll just add, a staple of network science is to point out that in any kind of popularity network, there is this asymmetry. If you ask students in a class to name their 5 best friends, you will find 2 or 3 students named by almost everybody, but they don't name almost everybody. You'll find some other students named by nobody. And so you get an asymmetry of recognition in this, even without the technology. And so I'm wondering how, we should think about the extent to which, even outside this technology, we don't recognize everyone else equally. We don't note the co-presence of all bodies equally. We miss things.
No, it is, and again, I'm a lawyer, I work with language, I work with rhetoric, and it seems to me that the power of language to give life or not is grammatical, it's syntactical. And I see that sort of syntactical complexity is also in coded language, in what technology is doing to grant life, in the same way that saying a slave is only 3/5 of a human being, or using the word like chattel slavery, that you are the equivalent of a cow or cattle, devivifies somebody that has actual consequence in the world. And so it seems to me that is, to do, the degree to which lawyers are not as perhaps fluent as digital natives in what coded assortments are doing or algorithms are doing, is why I think that, we have to be aware of how language operates at any level, whether it's visual language, whether it's mathematical language, whether it's, and so it seems to me that that's one dimension of the problem. But I was also referring to, the way in which we are also metaphor machines, meme making machines, and so the difference, as Professor Damasio said, between a mollusk and a human being doesn't mean that the mollusk is any less alive to some degree, but yet the way in which we wrap them up, not just in bacon but in language. I'm thinking of what is it? What is there was a wonderful journalist, David Foster Wallace, who wrote a lovely piece called Consider the Lobster. And he had actually been assigned by Gourmet magazine to go to a lobster festival in Maine, just to write about the eating of lobster and the great feast. And he got there and he saw all these live lobsters being dropped into boiling water. And he said, we would never do that with cows. We would go to Texas, we wouldn't expect a live cow to be dropped into a boiling vat of barbecue sauce. And he spends some time extricating the degree to which we are not just sensory creatures in a different way that lobsters are, but that we have a spinal cord, and is that sensation of pain associated with a sensory mechanism and organism that we identify as neural, having to do with a central nervous system, as opposed to a lobster which supposedly doesn't feel pain, but it actually does. It has ganglia located throughout its body, and whether or not that makes a difference is an ethical matter in terms of degrees of life. And so if one gets into the discourse of degrees of life, I keep wondering, is this simply the fact that we're using metaphors to distance ourselves from the pain or the death that we don't want to take responsibility for? Or is there actually something like a distancing mechanism going on when we look at very primitive, self-replicating mathematical codes that seem to that behave like something which, if we didn't think of it as simply numeracy, or we didn't think of it as so different from our neural selves, our human neural selves or our mammalian neural cells, might actually resemble these very primitive self-replicating forms. Anyway, I'm babbling, sorry.
Antonio, let me push this back to you, the same question in a different way. One of the things I've found really interesting and a learning for me from your work has to do with the extent to which the nervous system, as you put it, appears late in the ontology of development here. But if I understand you correctly, you don't mean the other things go away. You mean they complement the nervous system still. So in biological terms, chemistry still matters. Feelings in the body are shaped by chemistry, not just the nervous system in various ways. And one of your arguments is that organisms achieve homeostasis not just as individuals, but in socially organized groups. So even before and without consciousness and culture, there is socially organized homeostasis. And chemistry and sociality continue to complement consciousness based in nervous systems. Once we have very high developments of mind or consciousness, that doesn't mean that we aren't interdependent, and it doesn't mean that we don't have chemistry as well. What does this tell us about the importance not only of our own body, but about other bodies, and how we think other bodies, and whether we feel co-presence with other bodies, or as Professor Williams was saying about the technology, whether we feel distanced from them, whether they become invisible to us? Does that change how we work?
Right. Let me address one thing that you said, which is most important, is that as we get new developments in our physiology, as the biology gets more and more complex, we don't do away with the systems that were there before. So, for example, there's a tremendous, even with us, there's a tremendous amount of our life regulation that is entirely covert. So it's intelligent, it's covert, it was working there probably in very similar ways millions of years ago, and we still keep it, and it's doing a tremendous job. If we had to think through the operations of life regulation that our organism, quote unquote, has to carry out, we wouldn't do anything else. We would just be regulating life. So still the majority of acts in our life are being carried out by a covert intelligence, an intelligence that we don't have access to. But the important thing is that at our level of complexity, we also need to have those extra actions that are taken on the basis of knowledge. And that's where the homeostatic feelings come in. And there's a sufficiently important number that we could not have life without it. So if you are eternally asleep, or if you are in coma, unless you're fed, you're going to die. Because if you are in a state of anesthesia, or in a state in which you don't have consciousness, unless you're fed intravenously, you die within a few days. So you just can't survive. So you have this coexistence of systems, which is extremely important. And interestingly, as part of our cultural developments, we have the invention of all of the machines around us that make our life more possible and more efficient in many ways, and which are, once again, going back to the conversation we've been having, projections of our system. They're inventions of machines that all seem to have some kind of body, some kind of physiology, some kind of operation that makes them a little bit poor copies of life. But there they are, and we're surrounded by them. And some of them actually do things that are very physically close to us, the machinery that help us in a home, for example. And some of them, which is the case with all the great adventure of computation, do things that are at a much higher level and that help us with communication and so forth. Making, for example, in spite of the very alienating way in which we're communicating this afternoon, we're still communicating and we're still having this conversation. And I totally agree with Professor Williams. I was very happy actually to hear you to describe this sense of distancing from life that comes from our reliance on electronic communication. And I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I've heard it from some people, but it's not very frequent. I think a lot of people, especially younger people than the two of us are, tend to take it in stride, probably because they have been using their fingers since they were born to communicate, and we haven't. But I find myself distanced, and I even think I have a suspicion if one interesting scientific project that we would need funding for is to see the degree to which this distancing through electronic communication has an effect on memory, for example. I suspect it does. Do you want to address that from your personal perspective? Because you seem to be very, you probed very well your experience of this.
Well, I think that it's certainly, in reading Sherry Turkle's work in particular, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert on memory, but I from what I have read, it would inevitably have some effect on memory. Even very young people can't remember their phone numbers, because everything is on it. They don't remember their family phone numbers. That's a very simple example that, says this technology takes care of memory, of memorialization, of memorializing our lives in very different ways. And at the same time, it loses some of our memories, I think, in this weirdly fetishizing way of young people taking pictures of every aspect. Every 60 seconds, there's a picture or an Instagram or a Snapchat. It is like going into some cloud where you have tens of thousands of documented moments of one's life that one never sees again, and one can't easily retrieve because there's no archival system at the center of it. And I actually, I have all these books behind me because I inherited a lot of family documents. I'd like to say I've read every single one of them, but these are a family inheritance of memory contained in these books that is palpable. I can touch, I can take off, and I can recreate. I don't see that being necessarily the case with some of what our new technology is supposedly memorializing, but it is ineffable. It's not palpable in that way. And so I even noticed my photographs of my son, they're palpable in little volumes up until the time he was about 10, and then they disappeared. And I have pictures somewhere on some technology that now I can't find the floppy disk to recreate. And so I think of Rebecca Lamoff's wonderful book on certain moments where they were going to capture all of human history on data punch cards, which apparently exist in the basement of some Harvard library, but nobody has the technology to be able to download it. And so I think that intervention with the archival nature of our historicizing our epic is a complicated question.
Right. So our archives are being transformed. Let me ask you, point out one of the questions from a comment from one of our audience members. In various ways, as mentioned in race and in other ways, we have a tension between universalized discussion, what we are like, and the fact that there are all kinds of particulars. The particulars are raced, they're classed, they are different, and they're individuated. But people also come biologically different. So one of our participants, Nihanuzan, points out, well, for the hard of hearing, there may be advantages to the computer technology, because face-to-face gatherings don't often have appropriate conditions for all of the speakers to be fully audible. And we might take this as a metaphor for noting that there will always be some people advantaged by some disadvantaged. Each technology, each approach will play out differently in the lives and indeed bodies of different participants.
Very good point. Yep.
I guess my question is, and then, it's true. One could say that about almost anything. And certainly this interrogation proposed by this entire conference is not to say that, a hearing aid is a bad thing, or all of technology, or all of what we're doing. I mean, in fact, this got us through a period in which some of us have just gone completely mad because we have, we couldn't be there in person. At least we had this. And so I sometimes hear the formulation of that statement as, hey, it has some benefits, so what are you, a Luddite? I don't think this is, I hope we're not going down that path of therefore, because it has benefits for some, that the critique of certain applications shouldn't be pursued. And so my concern is the appropriate limitations of the vastly epidemiological potential of data gathering to survey us, to sort us. And it seems to me that part of and again, I don't mean to attribute this to the questioner, part of our common popular response to that kind of, well, it helps the hard of hearing, is therefore you don't want to regulate anything at all. And I think that so that's my question. What's after that, the stop of that question? Because I think that there are ethical questions that still need to be explored in terms of the boundaries, the specific application, the situatedness of where we are in relation to what potentials.
Shall I continue down this vein of asking some of the questions that are raised by members of the audience, if that's okay, unless you have strong questions for each other you want to bring out at this point? Seeing no bodily motions reflected on the little boxes to give me the clue that you do. Let me bring in a few of the things members of our audience have talked about. One of them comes up from 2 or 3 people. I'm looking particularly at the version of it from Charles McCrary. That brings up a core theme of the project that is invited you, which is what it's been talking about as versions of post-secular science and what goes on here. And I'm going to go on to Charlie's comment in a moment further about racialization in governments. But our project has raised questions about does the idea of secular and post-secular, does that binary get in the way sometimes of understanding what's going on? Do we need to think about a post-secular view of science? One of the conference attendees asks this of both science and law. Are these both invested with notions of being essentially secular? And if the questioner doesn't say, but I'm reading into this, not just in the sense of not being explicitly religious, but indeed in the sense of a certain sense of temporality, to go back to Professor Williams' comments, in an idea of what the human is and is not. Is that embedded in the notion of secularity, and is there a post-secular moment in science searching for a rethinking of that, whether in explicitly religious terms or in other terms? Is there a reach beyond the limits of this?
It is why I think of hauntings and I spoke of ghosts, which I think sometimes are attributed either to superstition or to religion. And I hope, I like to think about it in a secularized form of imaginative space. that is a yearning for connection through the shapes of things we've been through, which we feel as ghosts. And that spirit is not, I think, the way in which most people use that term, which is more religious. But that spirit, it seems to me, is very much present in some of the discussions that I've heard in, around, for example, CRISPR, for example, where I heard somebody describe, and I think maybe popularly one hears, that genes want to express themselves. And so the agency attributed to genetic expression, almost like a First Amendment form of expression. Personally, I think that's a metaphor for allowing a certain kind of industry manipulation, because they have their own agency. All they're doing is yearning to be expressed. But I think it also is an assignment of a kind of godlike power that is, again, for me, a kind of projection of our mental state onto these biological systems, but don't necessarily operate according to the logics we want to impose on them. And that's part of our climatological disaster, is that we still somehow attribute our own agency to, or these are performing according, we're right. Projecting,
So projection would be how you'd say.
Yeah, projection, yeah. And that's where I think that either some notion of, a godlike agency attributed to things which, again, the actual biology would contest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're dealing once again with an issue of projecting our imaginations over certain phenomena, and I think the end result depends on what your mental structure is and what your knowledge of the systems is, and you produce either things that could be acceptable in literary form, or things that are ridiculous, such as genes want to express themselves. They don't, that we know of.
Or perhaps some, Anya Bernstein's not here, but some of the quests for immortality in transhumanist forms, or others, have an imagining that seems to be post-secular in two senses, both literally imagining a transformation of the temporality of human being, immortality, and imagining something which has previously been imagined in religious registers, but in a different language of cryonic preservation and downloading the brain into silicon and things like that. I know there's a difference between trying to diagnose what's the yearning and trying to say, does that make sense scientifically? But let me ask this a different way. I'm not particularly suggesting let's be sympathetic to them, but is there an analogy? I have heard in discussions of your work and others who describe transformations in the nature of being alive, let alone being human, seeing transcendence. Patricia talked about, Professor Williams talked about the extent to which people sometimes understand technologies as completing themselves, or at least offering the possibility of completing themselves. These seem to be calls for a kind of transcendence that is different from what most straight empiricist readings of science would generate.
I keep thinking of 23andMe or any of the ancestry tracking companies that that can certainly translate parts of our genetic heritage, but are delivered to us with labels that have a tremendous amount of social baggage. They are not really delivered as simply continental migratory responses, but they're given most frequently in racial categories, which has all kinds of, and sometimes in religious categories, like you're 12% Jewish, depending upon the company, the country, the company with which one is dealing. And it seems to me that it isn't just a problem of the labels not really being in alignment, that there are social labels attached to biological assessments or assays. It is that it is received by much of the public as destiny, and the advertisements accompanying this frequency, who am I? Discover who you are in that transcendent, really, it's the use of religious language that essentializes who we are as human to, our genes. This is the eugenic dream. I mean, I find it very alarming, this merging of that kind of religious language onto, the biology that was supposed to prove that we are all, we're all human, or that it was supposed to prove a kind of universal human subject.
It's so paradoxical, isn't it, to sort of put so much faith into those readings of our structure as far as the future is concerned. So instead of asking ourselves, what are we constructing in our future and with what tools, we're suddenly relinquishing all of that and say, well, let's find out what was at the beginning, because at the beginning is a sort of prophecy for what we're going to be. It's quite bizarre when you think about it. And you're quite right. The language in which it comes is so trite. It's perfectly comical, and I find the percentages very comical too.
Yeah. But it's a reiteration of manifest destiny with all of its religious baggage and colonial baggage, and that's very worrisome.
I bet my life has changed since I learned that I'm 100% Iberian.
Well, that's interesting to me, because I just always, what does that mean? But knowing various other identities that you inhabit besides Iberian, and yet also 100% Iberian. It's deployed as though that means not Jewish or something.
But also, it also reinforces the notion
actually, there's a problem, because
100% anything.
Actually, Iberian is also a component of Judaism.
Well, of course. But these things are broken down. So it goes back to the point about race that Professor Williams made, that when we race, we sort. And the sorting depends on invoking some categories and deciding they are strong and determinate. And so I have two questions about this. One, I started down the Charlie McCrory path earlier, didn't get to his real question, which is the human necessarily a racial construct? And let me just elaborate. Or if not precisely the language of race, which has a historic origin, differentiated in ways that we would now use, that people now use the language of race for. Is this essential to the human, or is this optional, other, and removable? And then he wants to know, of course, is AI inevitably racialized because of its origins in our current circumstances?
I diverge, strenuously from the notion of a manifest destiny, that we humans are necessarily raced, at least as we use the word race in common parlance. It's why I love some of what Lera Boroditsky does, and why I wish that particularly we in the United States, where so much of this technology is rising up in Silicon Valley, in a very small geography, is why I wish we were polyglots. I wish we had truly a much more fluid understanding of how limiting our culture and our language, or one culture, a singular monocultural perspective, can be. It's why I like that notion of what would happen. How would we think if we saw history in front of us instead of behind us? Because it seems to me, the magnificence of our brain, of our human brain, of our, is, shouldn't, it it gets me really upset that so much of our discussion is limited by some really artificial construct of how we measure intelligence, which is ability to play chess or something, as being the only measure of the capacity of our brains. And our human brains are so magnificently plastic, and capable of having any idea, and capable of being trained and framed in so many ways. And I think it is not to say that some part of our capacity, our human capacity, our neural capacity, is not inherited or maybe limited, but it seems to me that a large part of how we've organized society is about distinguishing, and again, I say this as a lawyer, those who are viewed as cognitively capacitive according to some human determined norm. And then we disable anybody who doesn't live up to that norm. And that disability, I think, that looking away from the capacities contained in the bodies of those whom we define as non-normative, is an enormous loss of sensation, of knowledge, of the possibility of different forms of synesthesia. I think we don't explore the possibilities that that avoiding the kind of essentializing. I think the question used the word essential. Are we essentially? If we backed away from it, no, we're not essentially anything.
Let me see if I can push this further. So
in the cultural sense, in the yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like that answer, and I'm translating Charlie McCrary's question, but another way of putting a version of that would be: is invoking the concept of the human always normative? Different norms some of the times, but is it, or is at least often and commonly, normative and normalizing, so that then it's, potentially that can be corrected for by attention to plurality and difference. But that's there. Another, in relation to what you were just saying about multilinguality, or our lack of multilinguality, people trying to define what was essentially human throughout the 17th, 18th, for a long time, centuries into the 19th, invoked language capacity. Humans have language capacity. And for various reasons, we don't invoke that as much now, but awareness of the language capacities of apes or things. But also, it was framed as humans have the capacity for language, humans have language, rather than languages or potentially multilinguality, right? So it was the Enlightenment sense: we have language, we have reason. Human is normatively defined by participating in that, versus the Romantic sense of we have languages. Humans have diversity. Humans have the capacity to transform. So, how has the notion of human and notions like dignity reflected a kind of normativity?
I just want to be very careful that I understand the question, because I hear Professor Damasio talking about a biological notion and a neural notion of what is human. I know that there have been lots of debates about whether the human refers to a species boundary, or whether or not that species boundary is actually more porous or more flexible than whether that's categorical. And I don't know the answer to that in the field of biology. And it seems to me your question goes more to the question of what we refer to as humanity, which is an understanding within social sciences. So I think those beg for slightly different or more nuanced responses depending upon which referent is on the table. So.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm prepared to say, different fields will have different perspectives. We have things like human rights and other discourses in which it kind of matters who counts. But Antonio, say a little more about how you understand the human, and whether it is in. I think I know some of the answers to these questions. Is it in any sense essential? Is there anything essential it inheres in? Is it changing and likely to continue to change further with evolution? What does the human mean to you, and does it carry normative content? And is it just biological in the sense that Patricia just referred to?
Well, the space of the biological is a bit complicated to define because, of course, a lot of the things we're talking about in the space of our cultures remains biological. So it's biological and cultural. I think the idea that we would stop evolving and there would be no more evolution to the humans would be very strange and very unlikely. But if the universe is going to continue, certainly not within our lifetimes, but in some other temporal unit, we're likely to see evolution of the humans. But I think that probably the best way of coping with your question is to say that there would be a number of biological and, let's separate it for a moment, cultural traits that would define what is a human, so that I could distinguish reasonably well between ourselves and wonderful creatures that we see in the zoo or that we learn about from news feeds. So I think that there are biological and cultural characteristics that would define something like the human. And of course, if you're going to separate it from the mollusk, that's very easy to do. And if you're going to separate it from simians, is a little bit more difficult when you really come down to all the specifications. But I still think it is possible. The most important thing is that the edifice of culture, which is important and which actually motivates this meeting, is conceivable only for a certain class of living organisms. And there are plenty of living organisms that would have had very little participation and will still have very little participation, as far as we can see, in the generation of the ideas and of the social structures which we can describe in our culture. So I would define the human largely along biological traits. Obviously, we need to have them, and then traits that have to do with achievements. What those species, what those organisms, which have, of course, a huge diversity in shapes, in sizes, in physiognomies, in colors, and so forth, but they all share this a certain number of functionalities, a certain number of biological phenomena, and a certain number of achievements or potential achievements in what we describe as cultures. Would this be acceptable to you?
Patricia?
And that's why I wanted to distinguish that from what I understand the human to mean in humanities, in the humanities, but also in law. When you mentioned human rights, I view the human or humanitarianism as an ethical command or an ethical demand to treat certain bodies in ways that recognize their hunger, their pain, their necessity for certain, for nurture, for flourishing. And that's contained in the conventions that we've seen that grew up after World War II, and that is a discourse of ethics and of law. At the same time, I think that there has been some recent critique of the degree to which it is so human-centered or so anthropomorphizing that we are beginning to reconsider in law the whole definition of the person in law, the legal subjectivity for that who deserves that sort of righted protection, which might extend to what Professor Damasio described as the animals in the zoo. Why are they in the zoo?
Well, I think Yeah, exactly. Your
Yeah, and you know, and
your
I'm
point
sorry.
is very important because, for example, and that's why the cultural achievements are so critical in this. Because, of course, the animals in the zoo, I think they have rights, and actually they're wonderfully structured arguments for giving them rights and for punishing people that don't give them rights. Peter Singer's arguments are very much the case. But I think Peter Singer would not claim that lions and elephants and giraffes have complex cultural developments of the kind we have, even if they have complex sociality.
And that's why and that's why I think it's a different definition of the human in that sense. These arguments, as they are being expanded, really are being replaced by a notion of legal personhood or legal subjectivity or recognition of the right to be accorded dignitary rights. Which is not to say that the lion is the same as a human being. It is also, I think, a reflection of starting to listen to certain indigenous sense, and which is not necessarily religious in the same sense that we think of it, but religious understandings that say the river as a right. New Zealand has given legal personhood to rivers, for example. Some people are trying to expand that notion, that ethical claim of the right to be left alone, basically, to the biomes and the ecological environments in which we are, which we are part and to which we give very little deference. And so it's again, it's a kind of ethical rewriting of our place in the universe or on the planet. That doesn't make the human being the only sovereign and the lord of all dominion.
Right, which for some people becomes the basis for accounts of transcendence. Yes. Towards God, towards nature, Gaia, towards human community and other people, or various claims. Antonio evokes Peter Singer, whose idea of sentience sort of expands the category, but also shifts the way the argument works. And so I just want to come back to the notion of achievements. So there's a kind of argument about achievements, what is accomplished by organisms of different kinds, which is also applied sometimes among human beings, which is part of how this ties back to the questions about normativity and race and things. Well, we judge people human by their achievements. So the famous, I hope but doubt, apocryphal Saul Bellow line about if the Zulus produce a great novelist, then I'll read him or something, is to say we're going to judge humanity by differential achievements, by passing a threshold. Part of what I meant by the frequency of the normativity. But another idea that Singer includes in sentience is, he wouldn't put it on Hegelian terms, but it's a notion of recognition, that we recognize the suffering of others, for example, is different from evaluating the achievements of others. And so if we say that we judge others to be sentient beings who can feel pain, that can transcend the bounds of humanity, but it's not based on achievements. It's based on, you can call it empathy if you want, or you can say a recognition of something similar. And it's a different vein of argument about.
And that's a very important argument. And certainly the achievement, the cultural achievements are extremely important, but in the case of Peter Singer, for example, the animal rights really come largely out of the recognition of pain in other creatures, or the possibility of suffering. And there, of course, you have to have creatures that are, you call them sentient, creatures that have feelings and have consciousness. And the possibility, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because you disappeared from my screens momentarily.
Maybe somebody's giving us a clue that it's time to wind up the conversation, which is,
right.
I believe, true.
Yeah, but I think that just to close, the idea of suffering is an extremely important one. It goes back to this, to what I stated at the beginning, the notion of feeling, the notion of feeling beginning with homeostasis and life regulation, and the notion of suffering being sort of the main imperative in the set of suffering and everything that leads to the continuation of life being very determinant in the way the system operates. I have lost all contact with you. I don't.
Okay, this disembodiment has been taken to a new level.
Absolutely.
And it definitely is disruptive of the conversation. Patricia, did you have anything last you would like to say to wrap up your contributions to this conversation?
Well, again, I just want to add that the kind of ethical discussion, and particularly when Peter Singer's name is injected into this, really makes me want to insist that we have a discussion about who decides that pain alone is the metric, or cognitive abilities alone the metric. Whether or not we have guardians and safety systems for protecting the interests of those who cannot express themselves normatively. And it seems to me that's the heart of disability rights conversations, because for too long, those who cannot speak normatively or express themselves in ways that are easily translatable have been described or treated in ways in which their wishes or their interests, their bodily interests, can be overcome by remarkable interventions all the way to euthanasia. So,
right. Well, and they're the great controversy over Singer's intervention into that debate becomes significant, and this, which reveals how fraught this terrain of recognizing the personhood or the humanness or the pain and suffering or the abilities of others is. And I'm using a vocabulary of recognition that doesn't have to be the right, I'm not saying that's the only vocabulary, but as Patricia's pointed out, the law may, in some settings, recognize the personhood of a river. In others, in Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, may recognize the personhood of a corporation in a certain way. We can be pushed in different substantive directions by the vocabulary. But you've both enriched our understanding of the difficult terrain that this project has chosen to take on, asking how shifts in science, technology, but also religion and secularity have shifted our understandings of the human, asking whether classic ideas like dignity have purchase without further work or need to continue to be rethought, asking about plurality of perspectives, as Patricia points out, the risks of monocultural views and the important contributions of views from other settings, and pointing out, this for Antonio, even the extent to which what is often taken as a simplifying reductionism, an appeal to nature, is not, since there's an enormous complexity and range of questions that arise behind the veil of that seeming naturalism. Thank you both, Patricia and Antonio, for being with us. John, thanks to the Center for its hosting, and thanks to everyone who participated in the conversation. We're very grateful for the chance to have had this discussion, even if it was in this almost completely disembodied form of Zoom.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Patricia. It was very good to hear you.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.